Well, we have a new poll out today, this one from Reuters Ipsos, and it shows a majority of Americans do not think Donald Trump should serve any prison time. Last week, the presumptive Republican nominee became the first U.S. president to also become a convicted felon, found guilty in all 34 counts of falsifying business records in connection to hush money paid to an adult film star ahead of the 2016 U.S. vote. Jurors were unanimous in their verdict, but the American public is divided on the punishment for those crimes, with 51% opposing a prison sentence and 46% in favor of one. That same poll also concluding a prison sentence could lose Trump votes in the November election. Well, for more on Donald Trump and where things stand right now legally, we're joined by David Weinstein, currently a partner at Jones Walker in Miami. He's also a former U.S. federal prosecutor for the Southern District of Florida. Mr. Weinstein, thank you for joining us.
Oh, Michael, my pleasure.
So, let's begin with this question of whether or not Donald Trump should serve any prison time. Do you think a prison sentence is likely in the Trump case? Could Donald Trump go to jail?
I think there's a very low probability that he will actually go to jail, and that's dependent upon a variety of factors, including but not limited to the fact that he is a former president and as such is afforded Secret Service protection. That doesn't mean that he couldn't be sentenced to prison and they wouldn't have to figure out an arrangement whereby he would still have a Secret Service protection. But there's a number of other factors that are going to a decision as to whether or not to impose a prison sentence. Look, there are 34 counts of conviction. They are all felonies for which he could serve up to 4 years in prison. But then you also have to look at what the crime was that was committed. Was it a violent or a not violent crime? And this was clearly not a violent crime. Then you also have to look at the age of a defendant. You have to look at the health of a defendant. And then you have to look at whether or not this sentence is meant to be strictly punishment, which it is not, or whether or not it's intended also to have a deterrent effect on the rest of the public at large and people who would consider doing this. And then you have to look at sentences that have been handed down to similarly situated defendants. How many other defendants who have been accused of and convicted of this same type of crime are actually sent to jail? And if so, how many counts of conviction were there? How extensive was the criminal behavior? And if they were sentenced, how long was their sentence in jail? So I think all of those factors together are going to contribute to a sentence which, in all likelihood, does not involve any actual incarceration.
Okay, in all likelihood, as you say, although that would be sentencing. And right now we heard immediately from his legal team, Donald Trump himself, saying that they will be appealing the verdict. On what grounds might an appeal actually be filed here?
Well, there are a number of grounds, Michael, that he can take up on appeal. Some of them starting from as early on as jury selection and their motion to change venue, saying that they don't believe they could receive a fair and impartial trial in the place where the trial was held. That one is, quite frankly, probably their weakest argument. Just because a particular borough of New York doesn't like you or that another borough likes you more, that's not justification for moving the trial. The judge heard their arguments, he evaluated them under the facts and the law and rejected them. But that's something that they will again raise when they take the appeal. I think that what they're going to focus on are going to be the jury instructions that were given, not with regard to how they found him guilty or not guilty, but rather this other crime that they found him guilty of, which was necessary to elevate this from a misdemeanor to a felony. And the judge gave a somewhat variation of a standard instruction and told them that they didn't have to all agree on what the particular crime was. And so that's something the defense will attack. There were some other jury instructions that they objected to. In addition to that, the judge did not allow them to call a witness that they wanted to call, someone who they said was an expert on federal election campaign laws. And they believed that that would help the jury sort out what the facts and the law were here. The judge did not allow them to call that witness, so that's something they will take up on appeal. The judge also set parameters for what questions could be asked of the defendant if he chose to take the stand and testify in his own defense. And the judge was going to allow them to get into certain areas regarding other cases where he had already previously been convicted, either individually or as part of a corporation, that were civil cases but not criminal. And so they're going to argue that that played into the defendant's decision as to whether or not he would take the stand. I think we all remember their motion for mistrial during the testimony that was provided by Stormy Daniels. That's something they will again raise as they take the case up in appeal. The problem with that is that for a long time they didn't object to certain questions. When they finally did, it was perhaps too late. And so that's going to factor into whether or not the Court of Appeals believes that's enough to overturn the conviction.
Okay, so several avenues that we need to be watching out for. Quickly losing time here, Mr. Weinstein, but before we're done, I have a couple more questions, so I'm going to ask for some quick answers, if you will. First and foremost, do you think a decision on an appeal will be made before sentencing? Is that how these things usually go?
No, it won't, and that's not how things go. His appeal is going to stretch out way past the November election. Quite frankly, we'll all be lucky if we hear a decision on the first level of appeal by the end of the year.
So if that is the case, then, if he becomes U.S. president, does that have any bearing on this case whatsoever?
Well, it doesn't really, because it's a state conviction. A president cannot pardon himself or anyone on a state conviction. He'd have to ask the governor of the state of New York for clemency or a pardon. That even raises the question of whether or not a president could even pardon himself. That remains to be seen as well.
Okay, so uncharted territory as we continue to follow this case. David Weinstein, really appreciate the time. I look forward to speaking with you again. As you say, this will drag out a bit, so without a doubt, we'll be reaching out in future. But for today and for this evening, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Glad I could help.